Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to your lecture on public shame. As you will probably have noticed, I've gotten even more incredibly high tech than before, and hopefully managed to figure out a way for you guys to watch this on YouTube so you don't have to pay download costs, and B, to link up the audio with the video so that you don't have to consistently skip between slides. So let's see if it works. So today we're talking about new media, particularly social media, and acts of public shaming. If we were in the same room, I would ask you guys for examples of people who've been publicly shamed, whether in new media spaces or not. One of the really significant paradigmatic examples of this type of shaming in recent political history is a woman named Monica Lewinsky, who you may have heard of. Monica Lewinsky had an affair with Bill Clinton when he was president of the US and was then globally shamed. She was globally slut-shamed. And he managed to, convincingly go on with his presidency despite this slight hitch, and it completely ruined her life. That is who she will always be until the day she dies, regardless of what happens. She's actually now done some activist work about online bullying recently, so it's really become her defining feature. So, one of the things that we want to think about when we think about public shaming is what happens to these people afterwards. What are the common traits that can lead to a person being publicly shamed? One of the articles I gave you, the one by Com, he writes particularly about the US, but of course there are other instances of these sorts of things happening much more locally. So this is something that I would like you guys to think about. Can you think of local and relevant examples of social media being used as a means of public shaming? Now, before we get too deep into the theory that I want to consider behind these ideas of public shaming, let's start by looking at one really powerful, also quite contemporary example. So the example I'm going to start with is the example of a woman named Justine Sacco. Justine Sacco was an American PR executive. I think she was director of public relations for a big US company. And she was on Twitter, as you are. She had, I think, 170 followers, somewhere around there. She was on her way to South Africa. And right before she got on the plane to South Africa, she sent an amusing, sarcastic, what she thought was quite a witty tweet, which is something that we all do. And then she promptly got on the plane and fell asleep. This is Justine Sacco's tweet, sent on the 20th of December 2013. Now, my reading of this piece of media text, when I look at this, I'm like, this woman's kidding. Right? She's trying to make a point. She's trying to make a sarcastic point, and whether you think it's in bad taste or not isn't really the point. She's trying to make a sarcastic point about the messed up way in which the world, the global north, and particularly America, thinks about Africa, that AIDS is only a problem for people who are black, so white people are somehow protected. And in saying this, she is jokingly satirizing this whole racist mindset that portrays Africa in a very particular way. That's what I would have thought, I think, if I'd just seen this tweet offhandedly. However, because Justine Sacco then got on a plane and went to sleep for 11 hours, people who tweeted her back going, hey dude, that's not really okay, she couldn't reply to them. So what happened was some random friend of hers sent a copy of this tweet to a journalist who worked for BuzzFeed. And we all know the enormous power of BuzzFeed in the contemporary social media scene. And a journalist from BuzzFeed then reposted it, suggesting, well, this isn't really okay, is it? And it picked up from there, and it started traveling and traveling and traveling. The trend map for the hashtag Has Justine Landed Yet? From when Justine Sacco was still in the air. She was still on her flight to South Africa. And this is what's going on Twitter, right? People have started going, whoa, ho, ho, I can't wait to see what happens when this woman lands, because there is this global Twitter storm about this apparently racist text that she sent. There's a German word called Schadenfreude, which some of you might be familiar with, and Schadenfreude suggests the pleasure that we get in watching, particularly Friends, but the pleasure that we get in watching other people fall or suffer, the pleasure that we get in other people's misfortunes. And this hashtag is a beautiful example of Schadenfreude, right? People all over the world are going, oh, it's going to be hilarious when she gets off that plane and figures out what's actually happened. So this is absolutely global. Before she was anywhere off the plane, Justine Sacco was the #1 trending topic worldwide on Twitter. This is one of the reasons that Justine Sacco was trending so heavily. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Perez Hilton, the celebrity gossip website that's run by a guy called Perez Hilton. I mean, he was much more significant within the media landscape in 2013 when this happened than he is now. He's sort of fallen off somewhat. But at this point in the history of social media, this guy was huge. He was really, really, really significant. So people like Perez Hilton, who have hundreds of thousands of followers, start retweeting Justine Sacco's tweet, and they're then going and finding images of her from elsewhere on the internet and attaching these things. So it's all gathering more and more and more and more momentum while she's still on the plane. This is an image from Justine Sacco landing at the airport in South Africa. I think she's in Cape Town. And this is a tweet that some completely random person took a photo of her, a paparazzi-style photo, and put it on Twitter with the hashtag #HasJustineLandedYet, going, hey guys, hey world, who I don't know, she's here. Isn't that brilliant? She's here. Isn't it hilarious? She's got no idea what's going on. Now, I don't know whether at this point this woman had switched her phone on already to find out that, she had become a global hate figure while she was having a nice nap on her economy class flight. But the fact that an ordinary person felt compelled to behave the same way that they would if they'd spotted a celebrity in the airport is really, really, really significant. These are some tweets taken from Justine Sacco's Twitter account. These all came out the next day. So now, as you can see from the timestamps on these are all happening around 3 a.m., right? It's the middle of the night in South Africa. She's probably jet lagged. She's just arrived in a foreign country on a different continent and found out that she is a global hate figure. She is clearly in a state. She's already found out that she's going to lose her job because her employer's gone, oh, we don't employ racists, and has basically thrown her to the wolves of Twitter. People are saying horrendous things about her. The threats that she's getting are unbelievable, right? Death threats, rape threats, because of course all women on the internet who open their mouths are subjected to some sort of threat of sexual violence. This is something that, people who are active online who are female or female identified are very, very aware of. So some horrible, horrible stuff is going on out there because people are going, this woman is an evil racist, let's make her suffer. Really nasty. I mean, one of the tweets in the corner here says, people threatening to rape my nephew or kill one of my family members. So people are also using their online skills to find out intimate details about her and her family, and using these intimate details to torment her even further. This is from the next day. This is the same day as this kind of overnight spew of hysterical tweets that she starts sending. This is a few hours later, 5:15. She's obviously calmed down, or someone's calmed her down, or she's been told what to do or how to handle it. So she sends an apology text, right? I am truly sorry for the hateful and malignant tweet. There's no excuse for what I said. Now, as I suggested at the beginning of this discussion, the tweet that she sent wasn't necessarily hateful and malignant. It may have been tasteless and tacky and not very well thought out, but I think if you think about it, and if you read later interviews with her or see later media stuff that she did, she spent some time, doing television circuit a while after this happened, after she'd recovered from her trauma, obviously. She makes it very clear that that's not what she meant. She was trying to make a joke about the nasty way in which Americans view Africa. But the Twitter storm was so intense that she is forced, despite this kind of freak out, this explosion of emotion that she's had online, begging and sobbing and begging people to leave her alone and stop threatening her, the only thing that she can possibly do having been publicly shamed this violently, the only option that is left for her is to apologize and to say, yes, world, you're right, I'm wrong. I accept what you've said. I accept that you say that this tweet was hateful and malignant. And, she's even hashtagging herself sincere apology. She's hashtagging herself, has Justine landed yet? Because there are lots of people who aren't following her Twitter account, but are following the hashtag about her. So she has to hashtag herself in order to get as much attention for her own apology as people are getting for nasty tweets about her. And the retweets on this were much, much, much lower than the retweets on a lot of the other material that she'd said, and of course much lower than the retweets on the original tweet. Fast forward to later that day, and what you have is Justine Sacco appearing on mainstream media as a trending topic, part of a Twitter firestorm. She's now made the move from some kind of crazy online space to being a legitimate news item because of the incredibly potent, incredibly powerful, very thoughtless and global way in which she has been publicly shamed for posting what some assume is a racist tweet and for not being available online to defend herself, which might have forestalled a lot of the criticism. Okay, so that is the terrible story of Justine Sacco, who is a really, really, really good example of the way that public shaming has moved on from the days of people like Monica Lewinsky and has now taken on a very particular life within social media. So what we're looking at today is we're going to look firstly at some theoretical notions, which is how we usually do these classes. We're going to look firstly at shame and humiliation as spectacle and entertainment. Then we're going to look at shame and humiliation as a mode of social control. Then we're going to consider what shame and humiliation do, and finish off with a few short case studies. So let's start with the idea of shame as spectacle. Now, in Discipline and Punish, which we've discussed in other contexts in other classes, Michel Foucault talks about a man called, please excuse my rubbishy French accent, Robert François Damien. He was a servant who tried to assassinate King Louis XV, and he was the last person in France to be drawn and quartered. This happened in 1755. Now, being drawn and quartered is a particularly horrendous type of punishment when basically you're attached to 4 very, very powerful horses who are then told to go off in 4 different directions. So your body is literally ripped into 4 pieces. It's ripped apart while you are still alive. It's utterly horrendous. Which is why they stopped doing it after 1757 when things got a little bit more quote-unquote civilized. Foucault uses the case of Damien as an introduction to this very important book, Discipline and Punish, which is about the rise of prisons as both structures and institutions. I talked about this quite a lot in the context of our class on data and surveillance, the way, the way in which Foucault imagines the prison as an institution and how the design of the prison and the design of the panopticon prison and of other similar institutions operate to further manifest the workings of power in contemporary society. So what this book does is it shows how public torture changed over time and how certain forms of punishment were removed from the public eye. So Foucault tells us about how, at the time of the Damien case, at the time of the Damien execution, Paris was literally full of thousands of spectators desperate to get a look at this incredibly vicious way of killing a person. Similarly, in London, up until almost the Victorian era, the end of the century before this one, people would queue for hours around the Tower of London to watch hangings. Hangings were perceived, public spectacles, hangings and other executions were perceived as public spectacles for everyone to go and watch. So, as well as being the precursors to the panopticon-like institutions of prisons that Foucault is concerned with, Public executions also served another purpose, right? They did something very particular. They operated as a spectacle. Now, Guy Debord, who's a French writer, he was part of the Situationist movement, wrote a book in 1967 called Society of the Spectacle. Debord was basically a Marxist. He was a follower of Marx. He was a Marxian. In Society of the Spectacle, he talks about the spectacle as a means of distracting the public from what the dominant hegemony is doing. And by now, for all the classes we've had, you'll all be very familiar with the notion of hegemony. So, Debord is talking about things like repressive regimes putting on enormous spectaculars or firework displays to keep their populations happy. He's also talking about things like TV and big movie spectaculars, the ways that mass publics are sort of kept quiet and kept entertained and kept distracted from the truth of the workings of power by these mass media and mass experiential spectacles. So in Debord's formulation, Hollywood and fireworks actually work the same way as a public execution. These are ideological spectacles. They imply a passive spectator who's distracted from the relations of power, so power can just get on with doing whatever it likes, because the people in the audience of power, the masses, who are the subjects of power, instead of critiquing it or fighting it, are simply just, standing around looking at it, looking at the spectacle that's been presented to them, going ooh and ah at the light show. Now, obviously, Debord was writing quite a long time ago, and in many ways his critique has been superseded. Other people have done very interesting work on this that goes past it. But the notion of this ideological spectacle as a political tool still has its uses. It was particularly prevalent in this country when we think about the World Cup. This event that happened, this spectacular event that happened that drew the world's eyes to South Africa, that was basically used as a marketing tool, a spectacular marketing tool that distracted people from other issues that could have been seen to be more important, issues like food and housing. And of course, crucially for our purposes right now, in the middle of the second round of Fees Must Fall protests, the issue of education, and particularly the affordability of education. So this is what Debord means when he talks about spectacle. And this is something that I want us to think about in terms of public humiliation and public shaming. These are historic examples of public shaming. The first image is an image of the stocks. This was a device that was used across medieval Europe and later. People were clamped in these stocks. You'd have your head and your hands shoved through these bits of wood. These were also used in America in the early days of the American nation and colony. You'd have your head and hands clamped through the stocks, and people would then come and throw things at you to punish you, and you would be out there all day suffering in the sun under the view of your fellow citizens, your fellow villagers, your fellow townspeople, your family, your friends, whoever. And depending on what you'd done, people would, maybe they would throw rotten fruit at you. If they really hated what you'd done, they might throw rocks at you. And you could be condemned to the scold. You could be condemned to the stocks for doing all sorts of different things. The image on the right comes from Slovakia, and it's what was known as a cage of shame. So in Slovakia, if you misbehaved, if you broke the social contract, if you did all sorts of things that were considered inappropriate or not permissible, you were shoved in this cage in the middle of the town where you lived, surrounded by your towns, your fellow villagers, your friends, your family, whoever else happened to be around, and you would sit in there for however long the sentence was, and people could jeer at you and laugh at you. So these means, these structures, these sort of institutional structures, these technologies of punishment were used to punish crime or deviance or misbehavior. But crime and deviance and misbehavior at these points in history didn't necessarily mean the same as they mean to us today. So you could be put in the stocks for being a scold. A scold, S-C-O-L-D. If you're a woman and your husband said you were nagging him too much and you had a fierce tongue and you didn't do what you were told, a magistrate could sentence you to be put in the stocks because you were a scold. So because your husband or the patriarchal system that you lived within didn't like the way that you spoke or said that you spoke wrong, you could literally be put into this device in the middle of the town square, and people would throw rotten apples at your head, and you could be there for 24 hours. So these are really interesting technologies of punishment because they're designed not only to hurt someone, not only to physically punish them, as in the example of Damian being drawn and quartered, and people being executed by hanging. This is also designed explicitly to shame you. These are designed to humiliate you. So public humiliation as a mode of discipline has a really long history in the world. This is not something new. It's not something that's specific to social media. I am very sure that there are examples of this sort of social mode in Africa. If we were in the same class, which unfortunately we're not, I would ask you guys whether you are aware of any types of public shaming or public humiliation that exist within your own lives, or your own differing cultural backgrounds or national backgrounds. There are people in this class who come from all over the place, and whether you might be able to pinpoint what some of those are and how these more traditional modes of public shaming work. So the link between what I was talking before and what I'm talking about now is that public humiliation basically is a spectacle, right? That's what it does. We all like to watch it. It's entertaining, and that's why public humiliation works on TV. That's why hidden camera shows, for example, are so popular. That's why reality shows where people behave really, really, really atrociously are so popular. So online shaming, digital and social media shaming, can be thought of as the contemporary 21st century digital media age iteration of things like the stocks and this punishment cage. Online shaming is the new spectacle of collective punishment. So it means that all of us, in inverted commas, us in the audience, we can watch, we can jeer, we can laugh, we can poke, we can participate, we can throw things, metaphorically, we can tweet our faces off, we can punish someone, we can collectively punish someone for either an actual crime, or as in the case of Justine Sacco, a perceived moral wrongdoing. So to move into the next topic, the question of shame as social control. So what is the difference between public shaming and public harassment, right? Now this depends on who's doing the defining. Public shame and public harassment can both be used to keep people in line with social norms when they're seen to be outside them. So, to go back to the gender issue, there have been these instances in this country and in nearby countries in Southern Africa of women, and this happened in Kenya a lot as well a few years ago, women who were thought to be dressed inappropriately, getting stripped naked by men at, for example, taxi ranks or, places of quite typically macho employment, stripped naked to shame them for a perceived moral wrongdoing, then that they're dressing in ways that are inappropriate. And as you can see, there's this intense contradiction here, right? Because the idea that women must dress appropriately is coherent with the notion that women must portray a certain type of morality, that women are somehow sacred in some way. And of course, attacking them and stripping them in public is the very antithesis of this. But it's an example of patriarchy violently manifesting itself. But this isn't the same. Even though this produces a spectacle, this isn't the same as the kind of online shaming that we're talking about, because the people doing the shaming belong to a very, very, very small and specific group, and generally the response to this, when it happens, is shock, horror, and outrage from most other people who see it and most other people who hear about it. So it's a very small in-group community doing the shaming. Whereas with online shaming, you tend to get this massification. You get this huge number of people who are engaged in the act of shaming, which makes it really significant and quite powerful. Another way that shame operates as a mode of social control is it suggests the idea that we don't trust the law to deal with wrongdoers, right? We don't trust that the law is going to punish people appropriately. So, in the example of Justine Sacco, people it's a tenuous example, but it's not like people would assume she would get prosecuted for racist hate speech. Instead, they must punish her. I don't know if you guys are aware of denial of service attacks. So denial of service attacks are things that happen when online groups like Anonymous, or often groups constituted on Reddit, get together and they basically attack the server of a particular company in order to stop it doing business. They will crash the server and the server will stop doing business for a while. So denial of service attacks act as a kind of public shaming of corporations. When corporations behave badly, groups of online activists assume that the law will not punish them, assume that the law will not take its course and do what it's supposed to do. So those activists take it upon themselves to use this type of collective shaming as a weapon to punish groups. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Gamergate at all. I think we've spoken about this in classes as well. These acts of this kind of moment of publicly shaming women who were seen to be behaving inappropriately within spaces of the gaming community. Again, these were acts of public shaming that were designed to punish women who were accused of being corrupt, because there was no sense that the law or that the social world would appropriately punish them for their alleged corruption, even though in most cases, it's been more or less proven that the corruption never happened, and that in fact these were just instances of intensive misogyny coming from closed quarters of men who did not believe that female gaming critics had any right to be operating in a space that these people thought of as being fundamentally a space for men. So in these examples, shame operates as a mode of social control because it helps certain types of people exert control over other types of people. And in a lot of the examples I've given you, this is about certain types of men exerting control over certain types of women. It's about using shame and humiliation to re-establish a social order that's fundamentally patriarchal, so that men who feel threatened by changes in the gender order can shame women into behaving appropriately. Now this is a fantastic, wonderful, incredibly depressing, but really interesting Tumblr. It's called Suburban Fear. It's worth having a look at. Suburban Fear collects screenshots from Facebook pages all over South Africa. And this is very interesting to me because this is actually some of the research that I'm going to be doing for my next book, if I ever get around to writing my next book. So it would be helpful if, fees could just fall already so that I could get on with doing my research. Now, what Suburban Fear does is it takes these images from people from Facebook pages all over the country and it puts them together in one space. It doesn't really comment. You can just have a look and you can, draw your own conclusions. So the shot on the right, the screenshot on the right says, Colleen spotted this chap drifting through the neighborhood this evening. He shows great interest in the contents of the car. Please notify Watchcom if you see him. He's easily recognizable with his mouth full of unruly teeth. Right? It's very, very strange. So what Suburban Fear does is it finds all of these, people submit all of these instances of posts on social media where suburban dwellers, largely white, take pictures of people who they see on the streets outside their home who they don't think belong there. Now, as some of you know from your experiences on Wits campus in the last week, we all know what it means when a certain type of person is imagined not to belong somewhere. Those of you who are white, who have been casually sailing in and out of Central Block and the Great Hall, waving your student cards the whole week, know very well that the police and the private security members who are looking at you are going, this person belongs here, because they're not trouble. Those of you who are black, who have been stopped from getting to my classes, know very well that police and private security are looking at you and going, this person doesn't belong here because they're a protester. So we're talking about the same thing, right? Loads and loads of the posts on this blog use words like Bravo and Charlie. So Bravo means black, Charlie means colored, because it's not now politically correct to say black and coloured. So instead people use these strange bits of terminology. And, you know, the idea that it's somehow politically correct to call someone bravo and not to call them black is very, very strange, because you're saying exactly the same thing and everyone knows what you're saying. But it suggests something about the way that discourse and anxiety work together. So in the case of suburban fear, social media is used to police the boundaries of the suburbs, right? What suburban dwellers do is they take pictures of people, they post them online, they publicly humiliate and shame them and claim that they are criminals because they are a Bravo or a Charlie who dares to walk down a road in an area that is largely white, or if not largely white, that is largely wealthy or middle class. Now, these guys may not even know that they've been publicly shamed. That's completely not the point. The point is that their faces exist online. And people can look at them and go, this person is a criminal, merely because they are black in a suburban space. So it's a very, very interesting example of the social control consequences of public shaming, in which what people do is they use these posts to alert their neighbors to be careful of somebody and to tell people when they should call the security companies. And in that way, certain types of bodies in certain types of spaces, it's continually reiterated that they don't belong there. They are continually pushed out discursively through social media, actively, you know, through the actions of suburban dwellers and security companies and people who work for them. You know, in terms of affect, in terms of feeling, people, you know, you're walking down the road and someone pulls out a phone and takes a picture of you, or neighbors stick their heads over the walls to check out and see what you look like because people up the road have told them you're dangerous. This is really, really significant stuff about how the boundaries of the suburbs, even in a allegedly deracialized South Africa, even in a post-apartheid South Africa where the Group Areas Act no longer exists. This shows us how things like shame and humiliation can be used to continually reinscribe much older boundaries that we'd like to think we got rid of, but we all know that we actually haven't. The third question that I want to bring up in this lecture is, how does this make us feel, right? What does this do? Why does public shame work, and what does it achieve? So if we were in the same room, I would ask you guys, how does this make you feel? How do you think it would make you feel if you were on the receiving end of public shame? How do you think it would make you feel if you were involved in publicly shaming someone? Have you ever been? I would imagine that at some point all of us have done this sort of thing. I mean, I know I have. I know that there have been instances where people have tweeted stuff that I've thought is really offensive or appalling or disgusting, and I've retweeted it with a sarcastic comment going like, you know, this isn't cool, or look what this person says. And in its own small way, that is my own attempt at doing some sort of act of public shaming. Now, whether or not that's justified is another question, because of course there are examples where public shaming is incredibly useful. And, you know, let's go back to the question of gender. There are a lot of female activists who've used public shame in their defense. You know, they've posted pictures online or sent messages to all their friends going, this man sexually assaulted me, don't trust him. This man on Tinder, you know, you get examples of people going, this man on Tinder sexually assaulted me, he's very dangerous, don't trust him. That is still an act of public shaming, but nonetheless it seems to have, as well as, you know, the other questions that we've been talking about, it seems to have some sort of justifiable purpose. Although, of course, then what happens if you're falsely accused? And this is when acts of public shaming become really complicated. So one of the things that is really important about shame, I think, is that one of the things it does, and this is also an idea we've come across repeatedly in this class, an idea that's incredibly important to thinking about how and whether digital media structure the social world that we live in at the moment. Shame is an incredibly useful way of creating an imagined community, a collective of people who don't know each other but who all think of themselves as being part of one group. What public shaming does is it allows us to go, well, you know, we the collective we are better than them, whoever the them is who's being shamed. We all agree on certain things, so our righteous anger, it binds us together and it escalates. So we can create communities of good people and we can all agree who is bad. So everyone who retweeted Justine Sacco's tweet could go, well, she's a racist, but all of us, we're not racist. That's why we're so annoyed with her for being a racist. It's a really, really easy way of creating this them and us dichotomy, a sense of belonging, a sense of moral rightness, a sense of moral superiority, right? And we all know that digital media is very useful for doing this. It gives us a chance to feel really, really good about ourselves without doing an awful lot of stuff. Now, the Com article that I gave you is about using humiliation to punish crime. So sometimes online shaming is about crime, sometimes it's about morality, as in the Justine Sacco case where it was claimed to be about racism. So it can help us to build up the boundaries of our communities in the same way that suburban fear, the posts put up on suburban fear, are designed to help people strengthen, I mean, not intentionally designed, but, they exist. They discursively exist to help people strengthen the imaginary boundaries of spatial communities, of spatial suburban communities. Online shaming can help us build up the boundaries of imagined communities by, helping us go, well, we all agree that we are not like X. We didn't do this terrible thing. X person did X. And by joining in the wave of shame being directed at them, we get to put ourselves on the other end of that moral spectrum. So, Com talks about pedophiles, and of course, as pedophiles, legitimate crime, Tinder predators, legitimate crime, rather than moral policing. But online shaming is more often actually directed to so-called normal people. So online shaming isn't necessarily connected to criminal justice, but rather to social ideas about justice. Right? It helps us to take collective group decisions about what's right and what's wrong, that we, as a collective who exists online, continually reinforce together. So some of the elements of online shame campaigns, and as with Justine Sacco, sometimes these campaigns are completely spontaneous. In other cases, they're actually orchestrated and designed. I'll come to some examples in a minute. So one element of online shame campaigns that's important is disproportionality, right? They're usually out of all proportion. The people being punished in this way probably haven't done anything that horrendous. Another element is that mob justice equals moral immunity, right? So all of those hundreds of thousands of people retweeting has Justine landed yet? Never mind, the smaller number directly tweeting Justine. Everyone who becomes involved in this situation of collective fear is part of a mob. And that means that we, the people doing the shaming, are morally immune. We may feel a little bit awkward later, we may feel a bit upset, but there are no consequences for us. This is what mob justice means. There are so many of us. We are so numerically powerful that we can absolutely get away with doing this thing, regardless of whether or not it's justified, regardless of whether or not the person being shamed, we might later find out that they didn't necessarily do what we thought they did. Online shame campaigns are generally not orchestrated by a single individual. They are often, they kind of develop very slowly, or they develop really, really, really quickly and just take off and go viral, rather than being designed by somebody who's specifically put them together with the intention of ruining another person's life. So they're an incredibly potent example of the virality of social media and the way in which information, feeling, moral boundaries, senses of moral justice, and examples of imagined communities can very, very quickly spread using the digital media space. Another way in which online shame campaigns work is they're often about claiming status. So for example, when Trevor Noah got his shiny, amazing job in the US and went off to go and be a superstar, there was very quickly a Twitter response where people went through his old tweets and found stuff that he'd said that was considered to be offensive, and then reposted it quickly. So there was this sense of cutting him down to size, right? That online shame campaigns can be used to undermine the status of people who are thought to be too big for their boots. The response, this is another element, the response may sometimes be worse than the original offense. For example, even if Justine Sacco's comment had been intentionally racist, the death threats and rape threats that were very graphic that she received against both her and her family, I think were actually potentially worse than what she said. This is another thing that women online experience a lot. When you are publicly shamed, the form that this takes is often so much more horrendous than whatever your original offense was thought to be, that it, again, is completely disproportionate. Another element is that there's no regulation, so the shaming campaign can go on for as long as it has momentum. No one's in charge, no one started it, so no one can stop it. There's generally no forgiveness, so even if you do admit your mistake, while the campaign still has momentum, while it's still going on, you will continue being shamed regardless of what you say. That is just how things work. So the object of online shaming very seldom has much agency in these situations. It's a deeply disempowering experience. Another element is the fact that online shaming campaigns very seldom actually achieve anything. So what the Justine Sacco incident achieved was it ruined one woman's life and lost her job, but it didn't do anything about racism. And it didn't do anything about, people who were crucially, frequently racist on Twitter. We can see this particularly in the US at the moment with the kind of rhetoric that's being spewed by Donald Trump. If the rage and hatred that was thrown at Justine Sacco was a legitimate social or political force, if that many people really, really got that angry about racism, then Trump would never have gotten this far. Which powerfully suggests that in fact what was going on in the Sacco case wasn't about racism. It was about the joy of being part of an act of public shaming. And then, related to this is the idea that villains are caricatured. So if you are a person who's on the receiving end of one of these campaigns, in the same way that Monica Lewinsky just became a slut, you become one-dimensional, you lose your humanity, which again is related to the question of agency. And then finally, there is the fact that shame can actually get turned back on the shamers if they go too far or if they're proven wrong. This is often a feature of shaming campaigns, but it's very unusual for that to happen in online public shaming stories because there are so very, very, very many people involved. So whereas a man who is accused of a sexual assault and is then later found to not be guilty, and in an instance like that, the shame may be turned onto his accuser. But that's not going to happen if the campaign has happened online, because the information about him will be out there forever. Just to, caveat that, instances of false rape and sexual assault claims are absolutely minute. But I just want to make the point that, all sorts of people are at the risk of these things happening to them. The more active you are online, of course, the higher the risk you are. So the final question then that I would want to ask you guys in this instance is, what do we think about public shaming when it isn't unfair? What do we think about public shaming when it's used to legitimately stop racism or stop sexism or stop someone from behaving really, really badly, but yet that person is still shamed? So, for example, I know some South African activists who are extremely active on social media, and one of the tactics that they use is public shaming, right? So if someone approaches them, these are people who are activists in the areas of race, gender, sexuality, gender identity, these sorts of really, really crucial issues. If someone approaches them online and, is rude to them or is dismissive or, prejudiced or vicious, they will screen grab whatever that person has said and they'll post it on their own social media accounts so that others can see that this person has behaved in this way. Now, this is something that we might think is a very legitimate use of public shaming, right? If you're not happy for people to know that you've made these nasty racist comments, then you shouldn't make them. You should just be quiet. But sometimes even these instances can go too far, because sometimes, activists are so caught up in their own activist work that they start to shame anyone who doesn't agree with them. And of course, that's also enormously problematic, because then those activists, even though they are marginalized, have their own powerful online communities. We see this stuff happening at WITS at the moment, where even though, certain groups of people are marginalized while others are not. So, for example, the protesting students are without question the most marginalized group at WITS at the moment. I mean, people are getting shot at, they are getting arrested, they're getting attacked, they're going through some really horrible stuff. But they also have a very strong online collective. So there's also this kind of strange counter moment where certain people who try and question tactics coming out of the protest are then collectively shamed online for being non-progressive. So this act of shaming can actually be used to police responses to what is ostensibly and should be a very, very progressive moment and movement. So shame can operate in all sorts of different ways in the online space. So just to finish this lecture off, I'm going to give you guys a couple of examples to think about. This is Thandile Sunduza, who turned up at the State of the Nation address in 2014 wearing this famous yellow dress, right? And she was laughed at. People tweeted, they took pictures, they said really, really, really horrible things about her. And this is a South African example, and it wasn't particularly significant, but she was a member of parliament. She is a black woman. She is not thin. She doesn't have what the mainstream, and particularly mainstream Western media, would have us believe is the perfect or appropriate body. And yet she dared to wear a dress that some thought was ridiculous or inappropriate or too revealing or too showy for a woman who doesn't have the quote-unquote right sort of body. So she was publicly shamed for looking like this, for looking fat, for looking wrong, for wearing a color that people didn't think suited her. So that was, an instance that happened and was over really quickly, but it was still really, really significant because it shows something quite particular about the policing of certain types of female performance in public and how that happens on social media and within the digital media realm. This is Rachel Dolezal, who I'm sure you all remember, who was, she's still alive, and a white American woman who passed herself off as being African American for a very long time and benefited quite significantly from lots of things like bursaries and scholarships and grants that were designed to support African American women, who, when finally called out by her own parents, said, well, I feel black and therefore I am black. And she was publicly shamed, and she has now become a byword for this sort of racial adoption or ethnic passing. And obviously it's a very interesting case because what makes a person black? What does it mean that Rachel Dolezal, who grew up very, very privileged with all of the privilege that accrues to whiteness, felt, in inverted commas, more black than white, and so just decided to claim blackness? We could potentially write this off as just an instance of a personal pathology if it wasn't for the fact that she was a very high-profile African-American woman who benefited enormously from things that were designed specifically to support African-American women who explicitly hadn't had the benefits of the kind of white privilege that she'd had growing up. So we could potentially say that this is an instance of public shaming that, had a purpose, unlike the shaming of Thandile Sunduza. This is another one of the moments that I really wish I was in class with you guys, because I know you'll have really, really interesting thoughts and opinions about Rachel Dolezal, about who she was, who she is, and what that means in terms of our understandings of race as a social construct, and also whether the public shaming of Rachel Dolezal sits on the same spectrum as the public shaming of Justine Sacco, and what those things mean. So this is Tim Hunt, who is a very well-known British scientist who had won lots and lots of awards and was extremely well-known, who gave a lecture. This was in, I think, 2014. He gave a lecture in a very prestigious space and talked about the problem with women in science. And one of the things he said was, you fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry. And that's why Sir Tim Hunt doesn't like having girls in the laboratory. So this also went massively viral. And Tim Hunt was pilloried on Twitter. One of the things he said was that women in laboratories were just distractingly sexy. So you can see some tweets that I've pulled out here from women who work in science, who took pictures of themselves doing science and made other comments, and then hashtagged them distractingly sexy. And in this case, you know, the online response was actually really, really funny and quite thoughtful, rather than the majority of these responses being death threats or rape threats or hate threats or, you know, things of that magnitude. They were generally people mocking Tim Hunt for making what was clearly an incredibly stupid statement. So what happened in this instance of public shaming is that the act of shaming itself was comparatively quite gentle. And it also made a lot of larger points about the way in which women in science are imagined and are thought to be, in, you know, the problems with trying to get women into scientific areas of study and research, when this is, you know, the way that men in really high profile positions think of women in science. However, because of the online shaming campaign, which was a gentle campaign, which wasn't particularly evil or vicious or threatening, Tim Hunt then lost his position at UCL, University College London, which is one of the best universities in Europe. So actually, the shame campaign did have a really significant effect on someone who was a very, very highly regarded, extremely successful scientist. So was the online shaming campaign in that case justified, even though he had said something incredibly stupid and damaging, and even though it's comments like these that discourage lots of potentially brilliant women from working in science? Nonetheless, the shaming campaign, cute and funny and clever though it was, still led to a very highly regarded scientist losing his career. The final example is a woman called a woman called Tim Davis. So Kim Davis is American, and she is very Christian, and she worked for the equivalent of the City Hall in America, and she basically refused when gay marriage legislation came in. She refused to sign gay weddings. She refused to process them. She wouldn't do it. So here you can see some memes that associated themselves with Kim Davis, right? Because she became really, really powerful. She refused to sign these forms. I think she met the Pope. She just refused to have anything to do with gay marriage. So all these memes popped up, and she was completely shamed on social media, but she stuck to her guns. She didn't lose her job, although I think she was disciplined by her employer. It's a bit harder for governments to fire people. But as you can see from the first image, a lot of the shaming of her had to do with the way that she looked. So people were shaming her for a political position, but they were doing it in a way that mocked her for being not conventionally attractive. So once again, it's a really, really interesting instance, because she, you know, in these campaigns, these memes were very funny. What she did and the stance she took, you know, I would say deserved some sort of policing, some sort of censoriousness, because actually it's not okay if you work for the government and the government has decided gay marriage is acceptable and people have voted that way. It's not okay for you to go, well, I'm a Christian and I just don't believe it. If that's what you think, you must quit your job and go and get another job. But you cannot dictate the principles of an entire society according to your increasingly minority beliefs. But then the form that the shaming took was also quite interesting, because it was so much also attached to ideas about, you know, what women should look like. And a lot of it was attached to larger notions that attempted to shame Christians, which also aren't necessarily progressive or appropriate. So these are some examples of major campaigns of online public shaming that have happened in recent media history. There are, of course, many, many other examples, and a lot of these are more prevalent in South Africa, and I'm hoping that you guys can think of stuff that's happened in your own experiences of Twitter and Facebook, particularly things that have happened within your own lives, much smaller micro incidents of public shaming, when people that you know have been victims of this. So when you think about these instances, I want you to think about them in terms of morality, in terms of spectacle, in terms of social policing, in terms of the creation of imagined communities, and in terms of the tension between punishing people and repeating dangerously retrogressive social ideas that make us feel better about ourselves in all sorts of different ways. That is the end of your class on public shaming. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I hope we get a chance to discuss these issues in person. Okay, bye.